Dear friends, welcome to a video presentation Analytical Method Validation of HPLC Methods, a Practical Approach. This particular video presentation will be having following contents: significance of analytical method validation, available regulatory guidance, validation parameters to be performed for assay method, execution of analytical method validation, documentation of validation activity. First is significance of analytical method validation. Analytical method validation is done in order to demonstrate that the method is capable of doing analysis as per the intended use with the required precision and accuracy. Analytical method validation is a regulatory guidance or regulatory requirement. So we do not have option whether it has to be done or not. It is a mandatory requirement we need to do. If it is an in-house method, then analytical method validation is required. To do any of the analytical method validation, we need to have some regulatory guidance. So these are the prominent regulatory guidance which are available. First one is ICH Q2R1, validation of analytical procedure. USP chapter 1225, validation of compendial procedures. IP 2018, chapter number 2.5.10, validation of analytical procedures. From BP 2018, it is 3F, validation of analytical procedures. If you want to do analytical method validation of an assay method by HPLC, then following parameters need to be done. First one is specificity, linearity, precision. Precision is again divided into three parts: instrument precision, method precision, and intermediate precision, followed by accuracy, robustness, and stability of solution. First, we need to discuss about the prerequisites of the analytical method validation. If you want to do analytical method validation, then what are the pre-requirements in our laboratory? All the reagents and columns shall be available. They need to be in place. Working standard and reference standard shall be available in laboratory. All the instruments which are used for the method validation activity shall be calibrated. Analyst who is going to execute the method validation activity, they should have a proper training and they should have a proper exposure for instrument handling and similar type of activities. First parameter which need to be done in analytical method validation is specificity. Specificity of an analytical method is done to demonstrate that the method is specific for analysis of analyte and do not have any interference of the excipient used. To demonstrate the specificity of the following activities need to be done for the assay analysis. We need to prepare our HPLC system as per the intended method. Then following injection need to be done in duplicate: blank or diluent, placebo preparation at the same concentration as used in our assay, standard preparation, and sample preparations. The acceptance criteria for specificity is the peak of analyte shall be separate and distinct, and none of the peak of excipient shall be on a retention time of analyte. If we have a retention time of 3.5 minutes for analyte, then nearby 3.5 minutes we should not have any other peak. Then second comes a linearity. Linearity of an analytical method is done to demonstrate that the concentration of analyte is directly proportional to the peak area of analyte. For assay method, linearity range shall be from 80% to 120% of the standard concentration used in analysis. If the standard concentration is 100 mcg per ml, then what are the concentrations we need to make for linearity study? It shall be 80 mcg, 90 mcg, 100 mcg, 110 mcg, and 120 mcg per ml. Then these solutions need to be injected on HPLC system and the chromatograms shall be recorded. Then on Excel sheet we need to plot a graph in which on x-axis we need to take a concentration, and on y-axis the area should be plotted. Then from this graph we need to determine the correlation coefficient of a regression line. The acceptance criteria for linearity is the correlation coefficient shall not be less than 0.999. Minimum 5 concentrations shall be used to evaluate linearity. The above was the ideal case where the analyte concentration or API concentration in the formulation is 100%. In some of the formulation where the concentration of API is having overages, then the analytical linearity shall be done as per follow. Let us suppose that 50% overages are used in the formulation. Then the concentrations which shall be used for the linearity study shall be 50%, 50%, 75%, 100%, 125%, 150%, and 175% of the standard concentrations can be considered. Second comes instrument precision. This is the first part of the precision study. In instrument precision, we need to do a 6 injection of the standard preparation, and we need to record an area of an analyte. Acceptance criteria for the instrument precision is percentage RSD of the area recorded shall not be more than 2%. Then second comes method precision. Method precision is demonstrated by analyzing one homogeneous sample 6 times, and then RSD among the percentage results is calculated. One analyst shall do all the 6 analyses in one setup. So 6 different weighing needs to be done for the same sample. Acceptance criteria for the method precision is percentage RSD of the results calculated shall not be more than 2%. Then last comes intermediate precision for the precision study. Intermediate precision is also known as ruggedness. Intermediate precision is demonstrated by analyzing same homogeneous sample 6 times by different analysts and on the different day, and then RSD among the percentage result is calculated. Sample which is analyzed in method precision shall be taken for intermediate precision also. Intermediate precision acceptance criteria are the percentage RSD of the results calculated shall not be more than 2%. The difference between the average assay of method precision and intermediate precision shall not be more than 2%. Then comes accuracy. Accuracy of an analytical method is the capability of a method to determine correct assay value. Accuracy of an analytical method can be demonstrated by adding the known amount of the API to the placebo preparation, and then same shall be analyzed by the proposed method. Accuracy shall be demonstrated on the samples of 80%, 100% and 120% of the label claim. 3 determinations are recommended at each level. Let us consider an example to understand how the accuracy is executed. Let us suppose label claim of the API is 100 mg, compression weight of the tablet is 500 mg. For if we want to prepare a sample of 80% label claim, bulk equivalent to 100 tablets, then we need to weigh 8 gram of API, and to it we need to add 42 gram of placebo. Thoroughly it need to be mixed and crush the blend. Then we need to determine the theoretical target value of this particular blend. The equation which is shown on the screen is used for determination of the theoretical label claim. If you will place the values, then you can see in your screen that it is coming as 79.2% of the label claim. So we have prepared the sample which is having an actual potency of 79.2%. Then this sample shall be analyzed, and whatever result will come, it will be evaluated against the theoretical target results. Similarly, the theoretical values of 100 and 120% shall be calculated. All the spiked samples shall be analyzed as per the proposed method of analysis, and the results in the percentage of label claim shall be calculated. The percentage recovery shall be calculated by a equation results obtained into 100 divided by theoretical target value. The acceptance criteria for accuracy shall be the percentage RSD at each spike level shall not be more than 2%. Average percent recovery at each level shall be between 98 to 102%. To understand a relation between the precision and accuracy, these are the diagrams. First shows inaccurate and imprecise. Second shows inaccurate but precise. And third shows accurate and precise. Then comes robustness. Robustness of an analytical method is its capability to perform even in the case of minor changes in it. Robustness of an analytical method is demonstrated by analyzing the same homogeneous sample in a standard condition and then by doing the deliberated changes in the method. The changes which can be done in the method, some of the examples are given below. By changing in the flow by plus minus 0.1 ml of the standard flow, by change in the pH by plus minus 0.2 of a standard pH, change in the wavelength of plus minus 0.2 nanometer of a standard wavelength, change in the composition of mobile phase may be up to 5%. By change in the make of the column, keeping the technical specification same. Technical specification same means we can change the make of the column, company of the column, but technical specification like your length of the column, diameter or particle size, it should be remain same and packing will remain sham. By change in temperature of the column oven may be by 2 degree or 5 degrees centigrade. All the analysis at each change shall be done in triplicate. The results obtained in the method precision can be considered as the results of the standard condition analysis. The acceptance criteria for robustness shall be the RSD between the three analyses at each changed condition shall not be more than 2%. The difference between the results obtained, average of precision assay and average results at the changed condition shall not be more than 2%. Last parameter is stability of solution. In stability of solution, the standard and sample preparation shall be prepared as per the proposed method. The standard sample shall be injected in replicate to just after preparation, and then same shall be repeated after periodic interval like 0 hours, 8 hours, 16 hours, 24 hours, 32 hours, or any other periodic intervals can be chosen. Acceptance criteria. The solution are considered stable till the average area of initial preparation is not changed by 2%. Now final comes the documentation. So whatever analytical method validation we are doing, it is guided through a protocol. So we need to prepare a protocol for analytical method validation in which the procedure should be specified. It should specify the objective, scope, responsibilities, training, prerequisites, then procedures to do analytical method validation, acceptance criteria, and summary preparation should be specified. Similarly, we need to prepare a template where all the results and raw data need to be captured which are generated during execution of analytical method validation. After execution of validation, the AMV report shall be prepared. That sums up the analytical method validation by HPLC. The upcoming video shall be analytical method validation of UV and titrimetric assay, followed by other similar topics which are useful for the pharma professionals. Comment on the contents of for further improvement, so that whatever the required contents are there, that can be uploaded. If you like the video, please share and subscribe for regular updates of my channel, Easy Quality Learning. Thank you very much.